Hello. So, um, so this week, you guys, in your discussion board, we're looking at phenomenology, and you guys did a good job. It's a very hard topic. I thought what I would do is I'd do this week's video trying to pull out what is it that phenomenology is trying to say, and how can we relate it to crime. So phenomenology is a bigger theoretical movement, philosophical movement. And to understand what phenomenology is, we have to kind of back up a little bit and talk about a different perspective, something called German idealism, in particular the work of Immanuel Kant. So according to Immanuel Kant, he created something that he referred to as the categorical imperative. Or he didn't refer to that. Later people refer to it as the categorical imperative. Which the idea is that how do we know that what we experience, right, actually is real? How do I know that what I experience as a tree is a tree? And Kant's answer is that in a lot of ways you can't. So he doesn't deny that so like in this example, if I look out at a tree, that I'm looking at a tree. And he doesn't deny that there's not something out there, right, that causes me to have this sensation. But what Kant wants to say is that we can never see the tree as it exists, right? The tree, as he refers to it, is in and of itself. What we could think about is if we can't look at a tree and see the tree the way that, like, God would see a tree, right? We don't have perfect understanding of it. Instead, what we have is a series of mediations, which allow us to be able to understand it. What we understand is real, but it's not complete. So, like, if I look at a tree, right, that's fed through my eyes, right? My eyes see the tree, or even my other senses, you know, my nose smells the tree, whatever, right? So my experience of the tree is fed through and this is the term he would use, a priori of my senses. The thing that exists, a priori is just Latin for before experience. So before I experience the tree, right, my senses exist. And I experience it through my senses. I also experience it through the way in which my brain is structured, right? The way in which I think, what Kant would call the faculty of reason. So for Kant, my way of reasoning doesn't guarantee that what I see is real, right? But what it does is it allows me to understand it. So all these things that are set up before my actual experience, to some degree, color my experience of the world, right? So the question is that, you know, so essentially we're left with, after Kant, right? And so in post-Kantian thought, we are often left with this questioning, right? Is what we experience real, right? Okay. So we leap forward, phenomenology wants to find ways of essentially solving this problem, right? Because the categorical imperative, Kant doesn't necessarily set it up as it's unsolvable, let's give up. What philosophers refer to as a prolegomena. It's a program, right? It's a program to try to understand something. It's a project. So phenomenology is one of the attempts to solve this issue. And in particular in sociology, and this is the point where things start to become sociological, there's a figure named Alfred Schutz. And Alfred Schutz, which is referred to, he's talked about in your reading, right? Alfred Schutz essentially is the sociological attempt to solve this problem, right? This problem of the categorical imperative. So, to get us thinking like a phenomenologist, there's two examples from Schutz's work I'd like us to look at. So one is, if we think about it, these are like, if you will, thought problems. If you and I and you and everyone else who's, you know, watching this video were to, say, go to a football game together, would we see the same football game? Would we watch the same football game? According to Schutz, no, we wouldn't. Just like there's all these things that mediate our experience of the football game, and those change it, right? So like I'm in where I'm sitting in the stands. What I know about football, I know nothing about football. A lot of you guys probably know a lot about football. Football wasn't a big sport where I was from. So, so I don't even know some of the basic rules of football, almost guaranteeing that I'm going to see a different game, right? So our past experiences, the culture that we're from, all these things mediate, they get in the way of, or they don't get in the way, they allow us to, that's a better way to put it, they allow us to understand it, but they don't allow us to understand it the same. So how do we get to shared knowledge? How do we get to knowing whether what we experience is the football game? Right? Because if we all see a different football game, whose football game is real? Right? We'll get to the solution to that in a second. I'll give you the second problem. So the second one is actually something that he's stealing from Max Weber, which is something referred to as the woodcutter analogy. So for Max Weber, if I am to, we have this faculty, he refers to it as Verstehen. And so, which is, I don't know why they don't translate it in English. The word actually just means understanding, right? So basically what Weber's trying to say is that because we all kind of share humanity, we all understand one another. And the idea he gives, one of the examples he gives is this woodcutter. So if I was to see somebody chopping wood, right, I could basically know what the experience of that person was, right, simply by looking at them, right, because we share sort of this common humanity, that the experience should be translatable. And Schutz wants to be like, it's not, right? Just like in the football game, if we see somebody chopping wood, we don't know the reasons why they're chopping wood. They could be chopping wood to heat their house. They could be chopping wood to sell it to make a little more money. They could be chopping it for exercise. They could be doing it for all sorts of reasons, right? Those reasons are very important to the woodcutter's experience of cutting wood. In how good a shape is the woodcutter? Those things can be deceiving, right? All sorts of things. How the woodcutter feels about cutting wood is not something we can gain by watching him. So Alfred Schutz wants to say that this idea of Verstehen doesn't work, but that doesn't mean that we can't understand the woodcutter. There's something that Weber never suggests that we should do that for Schutz would allow us to understand it, which is that we speak to the woodcutter. We ask the woodcutter about it. If we talk to the woodcutter for Schutz, we can understand significantly more about the woodcutter's experience than if we don't. Okay, so we're rounding our way back to this football game. There's something that we do, and we do this almost automatically, and human beings do this all the time, which is that we point to the things that are happening around us. So within time, us together, we're all sort of existing in the same flow of time. Schutz wants to be like, if you watch people at a football game, they'll be like, "Did you see that?" Right? And they'll talk about it, right? That constructs what he refers to as intersubjectivity. Now, I saw some of you guys referring to this and being like, using the word relativism. In a lot of ways, Schutz in Phenomenology is the opposite of relativism. It's that sort of like categorical imperative would be a relativism. I see the tree mediated through, my thoughts and through my eyes and through my senses, but who knows what's out there, right? And instead with Schutz, it's we can know what's out there because we aren't caught or trapped in our subjectivity. Right? We aren't caught in our own perspective. It's not all relative. We can discourse about what's out there and figure it out. We can construct intersubjectivity. But the difficulty with intersubjectivity is it's only really there for a time and a place. It's subject to change. It's somewhat of an emergent phenomenon. We're always having to do it. You can think about people that you're really close to. So, I can't tell you about my own thoughts as easily as I can tell my wife. Why is that, right? My wife and I throughout time have developed, right, this sort of like easy way of speaking with one another. How did we do that? We did that through this slow buildup of intersubjectivity. So we have more access to one another's subjectivity, right? But how do we do that? If I stopped interacting with my wife, stopped talking to her altogether, changed as a person, right? We wouldn't have that anymore. We would lack intersubjectivity. The intersubjectivity would break down, right? So intersubjectivity has to be maintained. It has to be, because it's emergent. It's emergent from our current situations. For phenomenology and for Schutz, this is, so shared meaning, right? Intersubjectivity is really, we're really talking about shared meaning, we're talking about cultural symbols, we're talking about language, right? These things are emergent and subject to change. We build up social order over time, but it's not a social order that's consistent, right? It alters and it moves. It's not solid. So we exist in a weird world that like order never stays the same, but it's always there. It exists almost as a natural faculty for us as human beings interacting with one another. We almost have to construct it. So, okay, so what does any of this have to do with crime? Like, this is a interesting philosophical perspective, but what does it have to do with crime? And for that, to segue into talking about crime, I think we should talk briefly about another figure that our author looks at for this week, which is Mary Douglas. So Mary Douglas, and in particular, a work that she makes called Purity and Danger. And Mary Douglas is really interested in the construction of social order through the construction of categories. That everything in our world, right, according to her, is has a specific place. Right? So we organize things together. And I'll give an example of how this works. And we reinforce the way in which we put certain things together and keep them apart. If they cross, she uses the word contagion, right? That essentially it breaks some sort of rule and it threatens the existing order, right? But we reinforce that order through a series of rituals. Okay, so what does this look like? My favorite example from Mary Douglas's work is that of how we keep our houses. So we have a tendency to think that everything we do has to do with hygiene, and it's because hygiene's a thing now. We essentially have a strong understanding of germs, etc., etc. But most of the ways in which we create order and organize our lives around us inside of our homes don't necessarily have to do with hygiene. A lot of it predates it. And one of the things we can think about is something like dirt. You can live with dirt in your home just fine. It's not particularly dirty. Somewhat ironic. And this is the word that we use, right? Dirty. To describe things that aren't where they belong. So you can live with like literally like physical like outside dirt, right? But we have almost an obsession with making sure that outside dirt goes outside, right? Dirt has a place, right? If dirt comes in, it contaminates, right? It's a contagion. And so we think about like we construct the order of our home, right, by essentially creating this space. That's what we mean when we talk about cleanliness a lot of the time. And you start thinking about that if you think about like what do you do when somebody comes over to your house. There's all sorts of things you do that are not unhygienic, but are also not clean. Examples. Does anybody ever like bring their bedding out from their bedroom? Sit underneath a blanket when they're cold, right? You do that, right? And when you do that, you're not being unhygienic, right? But usually, if you have a guest over, you're going to put it back in the bedroom. Why is that? Because it has a place within the symbolic structure of your house, right? Your bedding belongs in your bedroom. Order has it in the bedroom. Well, if it's in the living room, it's a form of disorder. I don't know about other people. I eat in my living room. I don't actually have a kitchen table. My wife and I will eat meals in our living room and chat with one another, right? Sitting in, sort of like, leather chairs or whatever. So we take things from the kitchen and bring them out into the living room, and we don't necessarily always immediately bring them back. So there might be like, you know, a plate sitting on a end table or something like that, right? But we do this constant work of taking those things and putting them back where they belong, putting them back into the kitchen. I'd be very embarrassed if somebody came over and I had those things out. Why is that? Because that's not where they belong, right? So we enact this sense of order between rooms. Same thing with like, you know, like right now you are in my home office. I have papers scattered all over the place. I have articles strewn, laying on the floor. You know, it's an organized mess. Piles of things that I'm working on for my research. Piles of books all over the place, you know. I try to keep those things out of my living room, right? Once again, it's not unhygienic, right? It's just that they don't belong there. It's not order. If they're in the office, that's fine. That's where they belong. So every time I move something back into my office, right, it's a ritual that reconstructs the meaning structure, right, the order that we place. And so Mary Douglas uses that as sort of an archetype that we can think of almost everything as placing things within their place, right? Categories of appropriateness. But just like other forms of intersubjectivity, this order is contingent, it's emergent, it comes and it goes. And so often when we think about something like crime, a lot of crime has to do with the appropriateness of one thing or another, especially if we think about minor crimes, you know, public urination, right? The reason why you don't urinate in public is essentially you're doing something that has a specific space, right? And it's symbolically loaded if you do that in front of other people. Although, like, if you're like out in the forest or hanging out on somebody's property, you might very well do that. And it's not illegal, right? So order's vulnerable. It's vulnerable to change as we interact about it. And we can see this that like if we're thinking in terms of crime, right? Often we create criminal dictates to reinforce order. But those things themselves are actually more dependent upon our emergent norms than we would think. So what the legal definition of where something belongs, right, doesn't necessarily dictate, right, whether or not the cultural definition of that exists. So I'll give you an example. So I noticed the other day, or I've been noticing since I moved here, that there's something specific about the way that people from Atchison park that kind of goes against my sense of order. Now, my sense of order actually matches the legal definition, but the people of Atchison don't share it, which is that they park their cars on the sidewalk. In my mind, I look at that and I go, well, the sidewalk is for walking. It's not for cars. You're not supposed to drive onto the sidewalk. And in a lot of places in the United States, you would get ticketed for it. But here, obviously, that's not how it works, right? There's an emergent norm that differs from, right? So intersubjectively, right, in this play of symbols, in my play of symbols, the play of a lot of people's symbols and so other communities, right, cars and people walking do not occupy the same symbolic space. It's not necessarily that it's dangerous, like people park slowly. It's not particularly like you can walk around them, but going up above onto the curve to park, to me seems crazy. And that's only because I'm not from this culture, right? It's not that that's actually wrong. The legal definition would call it that, right? It's not that it's wrong. It's just that there's a different play of order here. Apparently parking out into the street is more of a form of disorder to people here. And so that here we see that like at one time, you know, maybe in Kansas that wouldn't have been acceptable, but at least it is now, right? So here you see like every time somebody parks on the sidewalk, it reinforces the order as it exists now. Right? But it could be subject to change. You could have, you know, a police officer who's particularly like willing to give out tickets, and maybe it would change, right? And alter, right? But that would be this sort of intersubjective construction. So what is and is not allowed within a given community is this sort of emergent normative phenomenon. that we construct, right, in an intersubjective way, so that it's agreed upon enough that essentially we know the rules. You think about, often the law assumes that people know all of the laws, yet, it takes an expert to understand it. Sort of a weird contradiction, but in reality, how the law gets enforced is far more interactive, right? People are interacting around that legal code, and how they come to understand it together will really determine how that legal code plays out. Most of the laws on the books are not enforced, right? And there is no intersubjective understanding of their existence, right? They can get used by lawyers, but that's about it. But as the law functions in a day-to-day way, right, it functions through this intersubjectivity. So that's kind of an example of how you would apply phenomenology to crime, right? Okay, we have one more week of class. We are going to talk about forms of critical criminology. Critical criminology, as I'll talk about more next week, is it's a way of trying to bring criminological theory closer in line with broader sociological theory. And we'll talk about how that happens and why is it that criminology and sociology sometimes have this split. And how is it that people are trying to overcome it. Like I said, I'll talk about that more in the next video. Read the Chambliss article and post your discussions. Thank you. Have a great week and stay safe. Bye.